Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. In 2015, 11.5 million documents were leaked from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca. The leak came to be known as the Panama Papers, and it detailed how the world's elite, celebrities, politicians, CEOs, were hiding their money in order to avoid taxes. The documentary The Panama Papers by filmmaker Alex Winter doesn't just detail the people whose money was being hidden, but the journalists who uncovered this and the almost Herculean task it was to pore over all these documents. Let's take a look.
We turn now to the bombshell causing shockwaves around the world.
The largest leak of secret documents in history.
This was a really important leak. We had emails, we had passport scans, we had corporation documents.
We had the goods on how it worked.
There's another set of tax rules for the fortunate and the well-connected.
Income inequality, poverty, drug trafficking. A lot of the keys to addressing those problems are in the Panama Papers.
This is all about secrecy.
Underground rivers of money, unbeknownst to most people.
If you find money tied to Bashar al-Assad and to Vladimir Putin, maybe it's not a good idea that only I know.
I wondered if we could keep this whole project secret.
We had to live a double life. That was really, really scary.
It's real. Journalists have been killed.
Everything you thought was happening, here's the evidence, it is.
Politicians are trying to distance themselves from the Panama Papers.
Everybody, please welcome Alex Winter. Alex, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Congratulations on what I think is your 5th documentary release this year that you've made.
No, it feels that way.
Second,
yeah,
right?
Second. Yeah.
The other one was Blockchain,
yeah,
right?
Trust Machine, yeah.
Trust Machine.
It's really coming out in March, but we did a sort of preemptive theatrical release on that.
So tell me, how did the Panama Papers start for you?
Well, you know,
kind of how it started for all of us.
Course,
how did it start for you as the filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've been doing stories about journalism and whistleblowers and data leaks, things like that are of interest to me, and I've been in that space for a while.
The digital space as well, with the Napster film. Yeah.
Exactly, and the film on the deep web, and then I had done a short film for Laura Purchas's Field of Vision about a journalist who got out of jail who had been doing stuff in the cyberspace as well. So I was very, very interested in the story, I was very interested in this idea of trying to examine sort of 2 tracks. One was the big story of income inequality and what the Panama Papers actually represents, which I felt while the news break was big, it hadn't really had as much impact as I thought it could or should, and for a lot of reasons. I thought a doc may help that. And I also wanted to pursue those questions with the doc of why it didn't have the impact, what was really going on behind this thing. But it was the biggest coordinated act of journalism in history. So that just seemed, you know, the docs are always about finding interesting subjects. And I knew the people behind that, like how did they keep it secret? How did they do it without getting hurt? That to me seemed like a really interesting story for a doc.
Well, a doc can do 2 things. One, find interesting subjects, but a doc can also explore the systemic issues behind a story rather than do what our day-to-day 24/7 media coverage does, which is sort of find a villain, pinpoint that person for the day, and then move on to the next one. We see that with income inequality like this, and we see that with the Me Too movement as well, making it simply about this one predator rather than the system as a whole that creates a situation like this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good, you know, correlative, frankly. And I've, you know, been interested in both of those issues. And you know, the other thing that happens rightly with journalism is that you're often targeting, you know, something local. So this is a big global story. So people were covering Brazil, or they were covering Russia, or they were covering what was going on in the US. Whereas with a doc, we can really tell a much broader story and scope, which allows you to sort of see the underlying themes that connects all of it together.
When did you find, and it was one of the aspects that I really loved about the filmmaking, was when did you find the structure that you set up, which is that, like, okay, they ended up finding more journalists to cover this as it progressed, but then taking that sort of progressive story and in the middle of that cutting in these sort of broader ideas about what things meant that also kind of allowed you to sort of tangentially move ahead of where the story was, but then also come back. It's really cool.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, finding a temporal structure is kind of the heart of almost every documentary. And this one was challenging because the story itself had broken, but there were still so many things happening. I mean, there are going to be things happening as a result of this story for a decade because there was just a giant trove that they uncovered. And halfway through shooting, one of the journalists was assassinated, and we started to deal with that.
happened while you were shooting?
Oh yeah, like bang in the middle of production. So, you know, there were a lot of things that were breaking while we were going. So for me, I felt like it was important to track the arc of the journalist, some of which was retrospective, things that had already happened, with things that were currently happening, and then balance that against, as you said, these themes of why it was important, why it mattered. But I also wanted to do that I want the audience to take a journey, because it's a movie at the end of the day, right? It's not a magazine article. So I really wanted the audience to experience what it was like to cover this story and have the kind of slow creeping realization of what this thing meant on a bigger scale, just like that had happened to the journalists who worked on the story. I think very few of them came into it, even if they were well-versed in offshore tax evasion or things that may seem kind of dry or not that interesting. And pretty much to a man, you could see the light bulb go off, go, oh, this is about something so much bigger than that.
How hard was it for you to pinpoint that and to ride that line? Because I think so often, and even your journalists in this say that at one point, offshore tax havens, we've explored that before, so what?
Yeah.
So how hard was it for you as a filmmaker to make sure that you hammered home how important this is, while at the same time maybe not lingering too long on it and maintaining interest and entertainment?
Right, yeah, I think that's the balance is you know, most documentaries that I've made, and I think in general, you often don't want to be super direct. You know, you're finding other ways of conveying something. With this one, I felt that the underlying issues were so difficult to understand on one hand, and yet so incredibly simple on the other, that I did take a more direct approach and just come right out and say, this is what's going on.
These are the consequences of
exactly.
tax.
Why does it matter to you? What is, you know, and I think that sort of core theme that no, it's not that the rich are just not paying taxes on their money. It's basically theft of your resources. They're reaching into your pocket. They're taking away your health care, taking away your ability to have an education, to have clean water, to sort of living in a functioning society globally. That's really the takeaway. And I felt it was very important to get people to clock that. But again, I was able to use the journalist's journey as a way to get that information across, because these are revelations they were having. Like, oh, it's not just about tax evasion. It's about systemic corruption.
And one of the, I think, great points that's driven home in the movie is that two of the greatest tax havens in the world are the UK and the United States.
Yeah.
And the more that we see sort of global capitalism reach its tentacles across the globe, I mean, it's not even reaching, it just is at this point. I think we also see the tenets and the philosophy of the US and the UK and its relationship to capitalism happen across the globe as well.
I mean, that's really the story. You know, the story is, you know, they talk about Panama, they talk about other smaller countries or third world countries. The reality of it is if the UK and the US weren't leading by bad example, you wouldn't even have this problem. You know, and frankly, in the US, our laws, our loopholes are so strong that, you know, Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, you can set up these companies legally. They're unethical, but they're not criminal on their face. There's a lot of criminal activity happening behind closed doors, but you can set up these companies legally. So that's the real problem, is this incredibly unethical system that we have that is often not even illegal, and the need for reform in those areas. And we're the biggest offender, the UK's biggest offender of anyone in the world.
I also think that Trump, which you touch on in this, is a great example of how capital kind of consistently needs to expand. No matter how corrupt it is, it has to get more corrupt so it can keep growing. So at this point, as much as the Panama Papers were released in 2015 during Obama's presidency, and we've seen since maybe Reagan these tax havens grow bigger and bigger, someone now has to step forward and be like, look, we're just going to legitimize it completely so we can keep making it larger and larger for ourselves.
Yeah, and I don't think that's going to happen, thankfully. I think that, no, I don't. I think that one of the you know, it's a dark world, and there are a lot of challenges right now, and obviously we have a political administration that is just, you know, stacked full of tax offenders and kleptocrats. So they're a shining example of what not to do. However, you know, this really did rip the scab off of it. It really was a massive, massive leak, and it was able to expose the machinations, the real mechanics of how these systems work, even for people that I know that have been investigating this for 40 years. It's a watershed investigation. So I think we are going to start to see more transparency. We are going to see more referendums towards making it more difficult to do this. Obviously, bad people are bad people. They always find a way to grow, to expand. And as you said, there's a tenet of capitalism that's just sort of fundamental to this idea.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's bad people. I think as soon as you start making a certain amount of money, or just money in general, you get an accountant, and accountants are trained to be like, this is how we're going to make it so you pay less in taxes. That's just a fundamental tenet of capitalism.
It is. However, you know, when we're talking...
Right.
No, it isn't. But the trillions of dollars that are being sort of sucked out of the system, that is not you and me and an accountant who's helping you dodge, you know, a couple of deductions. That is massive fraud, or it is creating incredibly elaborate shelters in order to hide vast amounts of money. I mean, there were celebrities named in the Panama Papers, and the movie doesn't really get into them because there are a lot of people who had money hidden that, like you said, they had business managers who said they don't even know that they're doing it. And to me, that's not the problem. That's going to always exist. I'm sure my accountant is mad that I made this film. Why'd you do that? but that's not really the problem. Is this almost kind of an aristocracy that we live in today, sort of similar even to sort of the French, you know, hundreds of years ago, where this very, very core group of our population that has vast wealth is just not subject to the same laws and rules that the rest of the population are. That's really the problem.
I want to go back to the administration for a second. I do think that you said, you know, they're a shining example, and I do think how much they shine might be one of the ways that we lead to more transparency as well, because more people are just more revolted and know about these practices because they're so glaringly obvious about it in front of our eyes. But at the same time, there's this idea, and it's touched upon in the film, that there has been a practice on the part of corporations, on the part of banks, and on the part of political parties, I think, to destroy the U.S. Treasury in a lot of ways, and the rules behind it, right?
Yeah, I think that there's I mean, the hypocrisy, and it's everywhere in this type of thinking, is on the one hand wanting small to no government, and on the other hand using whatever laws of governance that you can in order to steal more money for yourself. You know,
make it look like you're a part of government or that you're a part of the laws, while at the same time you're usurping what they're essentially there for.
Precisely, and using loopholes, using federal constructs in order to hide your money or to steal money. So if there really was way less government and a lot of these laws were relaxed, it would be even harder for them in the U.S. especially to do that. But frankly, I think that the administration we have is so brazen and in their own way, frankly, cocky about the degree to which they're corrupt in those areas.
Got that great Mnuchin moment in there where he's like, Senator, let me explain to you how my tax haven works.
Exactly, and it's incredibly patronizing. But the reality of it is it's not. These are not systems. The lie is that. And I think that the problem up till now, it's one of the reasons I was interested in the film and answers I wanted, was that you think and Trump did this with Hillary in the debate, I'm smart because I don't pay my taxes. And it appeals to this lie, this notion that every citizen should aspire to being wealthy enough that they're beyond the laws and rules that they are normally subject to. But that's not really how it works, because you're not going to get into that club. They don't want you in that club. And that club really does involve, at that level, just full-on theft and really criminal behavior, even if it's not, in some areas fully illegal yet, unethical behavior. So, what's happening now with this government is I think people are beginning to realize, no, the people don't win in this situation. The people lose. In every conceivable way, they lose. From the tariff situation that we're seeing now play out with GM to,
Yeah, there's like 15% of their staff is about to be laid off, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is not, these are not rules that are set up for the people. These are rules to steal from the people.
Right, absolutely, especially the tariffs. There's a feeling that you get that the tariffs aren't in any way about refocusing manufacturing anywhere. They are about playing the economy as much as possible to their own benefit.
Completely. It's a giant tax cut for the wealthy. The rest of it is a shell game, and it's not even a well-hidden shell game.
One of the aspects of this film that I don't think we've touched on yet, and it's right here in the poster, is 376 journalists. And it's said in the movie, we are in this moment right now where journalism is more important than ever, yet it is consistently being attacked. It is being defunded. It is, newspapers and media organizations are being bought by the wealthy, or are then forcing them to write articles essentially that they want.
Yeah.
What was it like sort of making sure that this documentary told the entire story about wealth inequality and about the Panama Papers, but also told the story of journalism at the same time?
Well, for me, it is a movie about journalists. At the end of the day, that's really what it's about, right? Because every documentary is about your subjects, and my subjects are the journalists. So the story that I was intent on telling was their story. I knew going in that journalists were under siege, and even pre-Trump, they were under siege. Obama was very hard on whistleblowers. The economy, due to technology, has been really hard on publications. They've had a hard time staying in business. A lot of people have been laid off. So journalists' jobs are already under threat. There were already pressures against them. And then in the Trump era, we've seen, and just in the world in general, the sort of swing towards autocracies and towards the right, we've seen journalists under direct threat, getting killed, death threats that have real substance. And as I said, halfway through shooting, Daphne Galizia was assassinated, which is one of the first times an EU-based journalist was so brazenly killed for her work. Unfortunately, since then, we've seen it happen 4 or 5 more times, up to Khashoggi in Turkey, as we saw recently. So it's a very dark time for journalists, and ironically, at a moment we need them the most, and at a moment where, given technology and given the ability to coordinate, it's also a golden age for journalism. And that was really the inherent contradiction that I wanted to get at with the film. And so the movie is really, at its heart, about the journalists. And I knew that if I told their story, by way of telling their story, we'd get the rest of it. We'd get the broader themes. We'd get all the implications of the papers. But primarily, we really are following them and telling their story.
What has it been like for you, as someone who loves journalism, is a journalist, to see when someone like Jamal Khashoggi gets murdered, that so many acolytes of the president rally around essentially Saudi Arabia's, I wouldn't say their right to do so, because they don't have a right to do so, but essentially finding excuses for them to do it, to murder a journalist in this country, which is supposed to be a major protector of media and liberal democracy?
Yeah, well, I think that, journalism has always been a way of ferreting out whatever the power structure is of your country or, your nation state. And the power dynamics, the power base's response to journalism, to a free press, is going to tell you everything you need to know about that administration. And so what you have is an attempt at a consolidation of power. You have an attempt at a consolidation of, Trump doesn't want his business deals with Saudi, scuttled by this, so they're going to rally. But
he could have just rallied without being so brazen and stupid about it. I mean, yeah. I can't say, for instance, that Obama wouldn't have stopped the deals with Saudi Arabia following the death of Jamal Khashoggi.
There would have been hell to pay for Khashoggi's death.
We can't say for sure exactly how that hell would have been paid, if it would have stopped any of the arms deals. Yeah. But to just be like, nah, we like the arms deals, it does no good for him as the leader of the country.
Well, not only that, I think it's, it shows his weaknesses as a leader, and it shows how easy it is to exploit him, which is why we're seeing pretty much every other country taking brazen acts, because they know they can get away with it, because they know that, frankly, right now, America has no leadership. It has no adept political leadership. And to your point, of course, it's not to say that, a left-leaning leader or whatever would have done everything different. But a leader, full stripe, would be helpful, right? And that's what we currently lack. And it shows you, again, if you're attacking the free press, it shows you that you're really not there to protect the citizens of your country, because the free press is really there for the citizens of the country. And it's the most clear-cut example of a power, an administration that's really not interested in its citizens. And we're seeing that again and again. And of course, it's very chilling if you're in journalism.
How do we defend the free press when, this is a tangential question, I apologize, but how do we defend the free press when we also have to defend the right of, Fox News? Do we defend the right of Fox News?
Well, I don't think there's anyone who thinks Fox News is press at this point, though. It's state TV, really, and Hannity's constantly bragging that he's not a journalist. Right. This is an entertainment channel with a very specific political agenda.
Well, Obama tried to ban essentially Fox News from the White House press briefings, and all of the other journalists in the briefing room stood up for Fox News and said they need to stay here. Yeah. Is that just a different time, you think, or is that just?
I don't know if that would happen today. I think that for those of us on the outs, I think it's always been a very slippery issue because of the amendment rights are extremely important. But I think that what we've seen is certainly in the era of Trump a breach of any journalistic practices. I think it'd be very difficult for any of those journalists today to say that they would support them on those grounds. Have there been journalists within the Fox News, camp that have practiced journalism? Of course there have been, and there have been some that have actually broken some important stories. But in this climate, it's clearly been a state TV operation, and one that's helped us, end up with this administration in the first place. But I think that everybody should be held to, some degree of account. I think that, again, news organizations, cable organizations, left or right, should be held to account. If an MSNBC crosses a line and tells a story that's just purely salacious or partisan, they should be held to account. So I think
the climate change denier on TV debating
right, exactly.
Climate change?
Yeah, I mean, we could list many different. I think it's hard to sometimes to watch straight up cable news because it is it's looking for eyeballs, it's looking for clicks, and it can be extremely salacious or one-sided. So I think the bar is high, but there's an extraordinary amount of incredible journalists worldwide doing unbelievably brave work right now to get real stories out. There's plenty of real news out there if you're interested in real news.
One of the aspects of, once the Panama Papers breaks and the journalists release the story, you see immediately people who have been the focus of the papers, who are within the papers, attacking the journalists. And there's this great moment where somebody says, it's like if you're attacking the knife factory rather than the person who's actually using the knife, which is something that we see in reference to so many other stories that we're trying to break in this country. There are so many ails with which this world has right now, but every time we try to assess or attack those ails, those who are responsible say, no, it's a bigger story, or you're focusing on the wrong people, right?
Yeah. Well, bad guys are always going to want to deflect attention from themselves. That's always going to be the case. I think that the great thing about journalism, and I've spoken to a lot of the journalists about this who work this story, and other journalists who have worked stories that feel Sisyphean, that just feel like they're never going to take, no one's ever going to listen, the corruption's too huge, or someone's going to get killed, or someone...
That's how I feel.
Yeah, a lot of us feel that way. But the thing about journalism and the importance of telling stories that you believe in, that you've vetted, that are thorough, that are credible, is those do get heard by somebody somewhere. They do. I think people are receptive to the truth. I think most people do, in their heart of hearts, know the difference between the truth and just outward obvious fake news. They may be rolling for partisan reasons with this kind of, the camp that's rallying against this type of news. But I think, it's like the National Enquirer when you're standing at the supermarket checkout line. I think most people know the difference between the Bat Boy story and a real story that might be facing them, though they may go for that Bat Boy story for entertainment or for a feeling of being part of a tribe that's their tribe. So I think there is great service in just telling very well vetted, very thorough stories. And I think those stories not only stand the test of time, but I think they seep into the culture in ways that are extremely significant. And remember, a lot of change doesn't happen fast. I mean, in a way, nor should it. We don't want blood in the streets. We don't want a revolution. We don't want a civil war, right? We want measured reform. And that takes time. And journalism is about that kind of measure. Like, we're going to keep grinding and telling the truth and vetting our stories and getting the word out there. And even if it takes time, even if there's casualties, eventually we will win.
You think incremental change is still sort of the way of the people and the way that governments change?
I just think it's human. I think it's organic. I think it's very hard to force things quickly. I think historically you can always see that generally doesn't work, or it leads to just enormous seismic conflict that has massive casualties. You end up right back in a cycle of where you started. I think in this case of the Panama Papers, we're seeing laws beginning to change. The UK is beginning to dig into some transparency for offshore. The US is beginning to look much harder, even in a bipartisan way. I think Romney's involved, obviously. Wyden is involved, and other senators, people in the House. People are starting to write bills, to start to work on legislation, referendums to get more transparency into these spaces.
Well, until Sheldon Adelson gets in the room and is like, hey guys,
yeah,
put a stop to this.
Yeah, but you keep chipping away, you'll beat Adelson eventually too. Yeah.
Oh, Adelson.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, you say tomato, I say tomato.
I want to ask you about your other documentary that you have right now, Trust Machine, the Story of Blockchain, which is in a lot of ways, it's not necessarily about Bitcoin, but it's about the transparency of blockchain as a form of as an economy.
Yeah.
I mean, how did that start for you? Explain it to me.
Okay, as briefly as possible, right? So, well, I've been interested in this space for a long time.
It's going back to the dark web, right?
Yeah,
Learning about that.
Even earlier, yeah.
Oh, wow.
I started to get into, the cypherpunk movement and a lot of the early internet, a kind of advanced thinking in the internet back in the 80s. And there were people writing essays about cryptocurrencies in the early 90s even. So when Bitcoin happened, I paid very close attention to it, and I've kept an eye on that whole space. I found it kind of, circus-like, to be honest with you. I think there's huge potential. A blockchain is just the record of transactions. It's a digital ledger. That's all it is. Of course, it has a capability to do a lot of things because it's protected by encryption. It's verifiable. It's pretty rock solid. And there are a lot of people looking to solve problems using those types of technologies. There's, a lot of things are old that need to be reconfigured. Publishing, copyright, legal contracts, you name it. Obviously, currency, financial exchange. So they're looking to these kinds of technologies to see if those kinds of technologies will be useful in building a new way forward in the information age. It makes all of this way more fluid. Now, that's the unsexy short answer, right? The reason I wanted to make the doc is that the long answer is that the world's gone totally nuts around this space. And there was this huge bubble last year, and people invested huge amounts of money into Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. A lot of those people lost huge amounts of money.
Some people made lots of money.
Some people made enormous amounts of money. I kind of sat back, since 2010 and watched all this without putting a penny into that space. But there are actors in this space that are legitimate. There are things that are going on that are interesting. Trust Machine, we traveled around the world. We were with the World Food Program in a refugee camp in Jordan. We were with the UN.
Some of it's used for micro-lending, right? Is that true?
Yeah, that's an excellent use for cryptocurrency. Micro-lending, exchanges, replacing Western Union, which is very expensive on a percentage level if you're a developing nation to get money in and out of the country. But then the World Food Program is using it to tag refugees so it's a means of exchange for them for food while they're in refugee camps. UNICEF is using it to actually track blockchain technology to track refugees. So you come out of a war-torn country, you have no passport, and you may end up making your way all the way from, Syria to Ireland. And that token that they've given you, a blockchain-based token, is a verifiable way of saying, I was here, I did this job, I did this job, I did this job. You can use it for payments. So, in the type of world we're moving into, where things are recorded more digitally and the world gets flattened in that way, is very, very useful.
So when Bitcoin and Ethereum and Bitcash and all the thousands of other coins became the sort of story around blockchain, were you sort of depressed by that? Because you were kind of like, there's all these other great things and good stories that blockchain is doing. And of course, human capacity for greed is just solely focused on how they can make a quick buck off of it.
Well, there's that. There is legitimate uses for cryptocurrencies, though. So I don't just think it's all blockchain and not cryptocurrency. I think that the space bears examination no matter what. I think it's very hard for the average person to separate the wheat from the chaff because there's just so much BS, there's so much hype, there's so much utter and complete nonsense going on.
Well, if you are interested in blockchain, the easiest news to gather is when you turn on CNBC or something, they're like, Bitcoin is down, Bitcoin is down.
Exactly.
It just becomes another stock.
Right, and that's the least interesting thing about it, in my opinion, and the least relevant. So, we made this film because we wanted to honestly, it's not infotainment. We really wanted to make a movie about people at this crazy moment in time, the good, the bad, the ugly, the in-between, and just kind of, literally put our arms around this whole space right now because it's really this mad carnival. And in the information age, we're just at an extraordinary moment. And even these technologies can be used for bad, just like they can be used. A lot of criminals were using cryptocurrencies till they realized that it's actually the least anonymous form of currency you can use. Because every exchange is tagged, and if you're a drug dealer, you want to use cash. You don't want to use a ledger that if it tags your name to something that is inescapable. Fred went here, then he did this, and they have everything. When you get caught in that world, it's like literally every transaction you ever made, even if you bought toothpaste. So it's not a great use for a tool for crime. But we did want to just capture this whole crazy moment. And no one really knows. The point of the film is really that no one knows exactly where it's going. We're not making a case for or against it. We're just saying we're living in this extremely interesting crossroads, and we wanted to examine sort of all the points of that crossroads.
Now, you have 2 films out in the same year, 2 documentaries out in the same year. You started as an actor when you were a kid. You know, I think you're best known as an actor for Freaked, a movie that you directed, plus Bill and Ted and The Lost Boys. And you've been directing, though, essentially since, like, 85, 86, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's only probably, even though you've directed a lot of stuff in the last couple of years, where it's like you are probably booked and talked about mostly as director Alex Winter rather than, you know, from Bill and Ted and directed a movie. What has that been like? Have you felt that change yourself in the way that people approach you and talk about your work?
Yes and no. I mean, I sometimes...
Change that you want or care
Yeah,
about?
I haven't really noticed it so much. So the thing is you're not really the face of a film. So even right after Bill and Ted, when I was doing films, people wouldn't really, you know, I wasn't in them. So people would just see, you know, they'd be in festivals and sometimes they wouldn't even make the connection that I was the person behind it. And films just sort of, you know, it's like writing a book. It kind of goes out into the world and lives its life.
Did you ever have a moment where you were being interviewed by someone?
Yes, I have.
And they're like, wait, are you in Bill and Ted?
Yes. To be honest with you, 30 years later, it still happens to me. They're like, you know, they want to talk to me about cybercrime or, you know, crypto technologies. And they're like, then they just start playing air guitar furiously. So, and honestly, because for me, I've been in the business since I was so young. I started when I was 8, 9 years old. It's always been kind of one blob. So it wasn't like I came out of film school and was like, now I'm a serious filmmaker and like, damn it, stop playing the air guitar. Yeah. You know, I've always done all of it. And it's always been kind of one sort of form of expression for me. So I personally don't mind. Maybe if I was known for doing something, acting in a movie where I played a horrible villain and everyone hated me, I mean, I do have actor friends that's happened to, and it's really a drag, you know? Because kids will, like, cross the street to, like, spit on you and things like that. But it's true. I just swear to God.
Like, I'm sorry I was the villain in Beethoven's Second. Please leave me alone.
Exactly. But like I was friendly with Alan Rickman, you know, rest his wonderful soul. But I mean, it used to happen to him. We'd laugh about it. He's like, I remember walking down the street with him once in London, and he said to me, "Look at you. They all love you. They all hate me." You know. But mostly, you know, with Bill and Ted, it's mostly people are little kids and are super excited. And I mean, what could be bad about that?
You guys love that.
Yeah,
that
it was
series.
so much
You
fun.
guys are all friends, and you're making another one.
Yeah, we're crazy enough that we're going to do it again. So.
Let's get a couple questions from the audience. What do we got here? Hey, right here.
Hey, Alex.
Hey.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So I'm studying journalism and filmmaking at NYU, actually.
Oh, great. That's where I went.
Ooh, alma mater. And one of the biggest issues or challenges that I've found when following stories is gaining access.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you ever had any access issues in this documentary or just in the past, and just how did you overcome those?
Yeah, access is key. You know, I'm really a filmmaker more than I am a journalist. There are certain aspects of crossover in a documentary because I am approaching sources, I am protecting sources, and I am looking for access. And access is key. There's always a point when you're making a doc, probably similar to breaking a story as a journalist, where you're not bluffing, but you're pitching a story on the assumption you're going to get the access that you need, and then you just hope to hell you actually can get the access, because without it, you have no story. And that has happened to me many, many times. I will say that in the age of Twitter and other forms of social, it's much easier to find people than it used to be. I mean, I used to have to sit down and really just hound all of the sources I had networking until I could make my way through to finding somebody. Like when I did the Napster story, getting to Sean Fanning took me forever, you know, in 2001. Whereas working on Deep Web, I found every single major source in that story through Twitter almost. So it's easier to find people now, but it is about trust. I think access is about trust.
What about a different kind of access where your next documentary that you're in the process on is the Zappa documentary, which I imagine required a certain amount of access to family members, to rights to the music. I mean, you're essentially at this moment probably telling the story of Frank Zappa, which nobody else has really told. So how did you get the access to do that?
It was trust. I mean, in that case, we went and pitched Gail Zappa, who's now no longer with us, but, you know, ran Zappa's business for decades and was an amazing human being. You know, I pitched her a take, and you know, my take, I think, was I didn't know if it was going to be what she was looking for or not, but it turned out to be what she was looking for in terms of it not being sort of a bog standard rock and roll doc, because that's not really what I do. I'm really interested in politics and culture, in the times, in a person's engagement with the times. I'm interested in artists and the difficulties of making art or having that kind of life. And that's really the story of Zappa I wanted to tell, and it turned out that's the kind of story she'd been waiting for someone to pitch her on him. So it was about establishing trust. So it's really, and you don't know who you're going to get that from. You know, a doc will always sort of shape itself based on who you do or don't get. And they're really of no value to you if you're not trusting each other, because you won't even get an interview, or in the case of the gentleman asked me about journalism, I don't believe you would get a meaty story out of someone if they don't trust you, even if you have the access.
Zappa's such a fascinating historical figure because he's this free-spirited, brilliant genius who had incredible thoughts about politics, about music, and I've seen so often misused and misunderstood by these sort of right-leaning libertarian meme makers online, right?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that? I
have, yeah. I've had a lot of people ask me if Trump was around today, would he be Ron Paul, right? You know, the thing about, no, if Zappa was around there, not Trump. The thing about Zappa is that Zappa was extremely pro-taxation. Like, Zappa was at the forefront of trying to get people to vote, trying to get people to understand the importance of taxes.
Pro-society.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Pro-citizens. He was not, you know, let the free market rule. He was absolutely, he was not only an autodidact musically, but he was a mom and pop. Him and Gail, you know, they were probably the first big independent record label. They ran everything themselves. It was, you know, extremely pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So
I think it's time for one more question. What do we got?
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to know, what do you want the viewers of Panama Papers to take away from the film? Is it more so awareness, or is there a call to action behind it?
That's a great question. Sometimes that comes up while you're making a film. I mean, I've never gone into a film as a pure act of social action. I mean, I'm very interested in that, obviously, but I've never gone in going, my theme is this, and I want you to do that. However, this one was a little different, because once the light bulb went off for me, just the sheer level of corruption and the fact that we're all being stolen from, that it isn't just, we'll just leave the rich people alone, like let them have their money. That, no, it's your money, it's your health care, it's your ability to have, you know, access to medicine.
Your roads, yeah.
Everything.
Your schools.
Exactly. And not just here, but everywhere in the world. It's the entire world, right? Is have trillions of dollars are being absconded with by a fairly small group of people. That in a sense became my takeaway, that I really wanted people to understand, A, journalists are fighting for you, right? And if you come to think of them as the enemy, you're basically being hoodwinked by very powerful people who, A, you will never be, and B, are not looking out for your best interests. And then, of course, this whole idea that this notion that, oh, taxes are just something bad, and, you know, I want to get rich enough that I never have to pay them too, is another form of propaganda, really. They want you to think that way, so you leave them alone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Because I'm smart, as Trump said, right?
That's right, because I'm smart, yeah.
The Panama Papers premieres tonight on Epix.
Yeah.
Incredible documentary, a wonderful achievement. I look forward to the Zappa doc as well. Congrats, Alex. And give
thanks,
a
Rick.
big round of applause.
Thanks, you guys. Thank you.